she, consuming a bar of chocolate, methodically breaking off small hard bits of the stuff, and talking of the office where she worked. On one side of the tracks, above bluish bogs, the dark smoke of burning peat was mingling with the smoldering wreck of a huge amber sunset. It can be proved, I think, by published records, that Alexander Bloch was even then noting in his diary the very peat smoke I saw in the wrecked sky. There was later a period in my life when I might have found this relevant to my last glimpse of tomorrow, as she turned on the steps to look back at me before descending into the jasmine-scented, cricket-mad dusk of a small station, but today no alien marginalia condemned the purity of the pain. When at the end of the year Lenin took over, the Bolsheviks immediately subordinated everything to retention of the power, and a regime of bloodshed, concentration camps, and hostages entered upon its stupendous career. At the time, many believed one could fight Lenin's gang and save the achievements of the March Revolution. My father, who had been elected to the Constituent Assembly, which in its preliminary phase strove to prevent the entrenchment of the Soviets, decided to remain as long as possible in St. Petersburg, but to send his large family to the Crimea, a region that was still free. This freedom was to last for only a few weeks longer. We traveled in two parties, my brother and I going separately from my mother and the three younger children. The Soviet era was a dull week old. Liberal newspapers still came out, and while seeing us off at the Nikolaevsky station and waiting with us, my imperturbable father settled down at a corner table in the buffet to write, in his flowing celestial hand, as the typesetter said, marveling at the absence of corrections. A leading article for the moribund wreck, or some perhaps more emergency publication, on those special long strips of ruled paper which corresponded proportionally to columns of print. As far as I remember, the main reason for sending my brother and me off so promptly was the probability of our being inducted into the new Red Army if we stayed in town. I was annoyed at going to a fascinating region in mid-November, long after the collecting season was over, having never been very good at digging for pupae, though eventually I did turn up a few beneath the big oak in our Crimean gardens. Annoyance changed to distress when, after making a precise little cross over the face of this, my father rather casually added that very possibly Vesma Возможно he would never see us again, whereupon, in trench coat and khaki cap and his briefcase under his arm, he strode away into the steamy fog. The long journey southward started tolerably well, with the heat still humming and lamps still intact in the Petrograd Semperfull first-class sleeper, and a passably famous singer in the dramatic makeup, with a bouquet of chrysanthemums and brown paper pressed to her breast, stood in the corridor, tapping upon the pane along which somebody walked and waved as the train started to glide without one jolt to indicate we were leaving that gray city forever. But soon after Moscow, all comfort came to an end. At several points of our slow, dreary progression, the train, including our sleeping car, was invaded by more or less Bolshevized soldiers who were returning to their homes from the front. One called them either deserters or red horses, depending upon one's political views. My brother and I thought it rather fun to lock ourselves up in our compartments and thwart every attempt to disturb us. Several soldiers traveling on the roof of our car added to the sport by trying to use, not unsuccessfully, the ventilator of our room as a toilet. My brother, who is the first-rate actor, managed to simulate all the symptoms of a bad case of typhus, and this helped us out when the door finally gave way. Early on the third morning, at a vague stop, I took advantage of a lull in those merry proceedings to get a breath of fresh air. I moved gingerly along the crowded corridor, stepping over the bodies of snoring men, and got off. A milky mist hung over the platform of an anonymous station. We were somehow not far from Kharkov. I wore spats and a derby. The cane I carried, a collector's item that had belonged to my Uncle Ruka, was of a light-colored, beautifully freckled wood, and the knob was a smooth pink globe of coral, cut in a gold coronet. Had I been one of the tragic bums who lurked in the midst of the station platform, where a brittle young fop was pacing back and forth, I would not have withstood the temptation to destroy him. As I was about to board the train, it gave a jerk and started to move. My foot slipped and my cane was sent flying out of the wheels. I had no special affection for the thing. In fact, I carelessly lost it a few years later. But I was being watched, and the fire of adolescent amour prompted me to do what I cannot imagine my present self ever doing. I waited for 1, 2, 3, 4 cars to pass. Russian trains were notoriously slow in gaining momentum, and when at last the rails were revealed, I picked up my cane from between them and raced after the nightmarishly receding bumpers. A sturdy proletarian arm conformed to the rules of sentimental fiction rather than to those of Marxism by helping me to swarm up. Had I been left behind, those rules might still have held good, since I would have been brought near Tamara, who by that time had also moved south and was living in a Ukrainian hamlet less than 100 miles from the scene of that ridiculous occurrence. Of her whereabouts I learned unexpectedly a month or so after my arrival in southern Crimea. My family settled in the vicinity of Yalta, at Gaspara, near the village of Korets. The whole place seemed completely foreign. The smells were not Russian, the sounds were not Russian, the donkey braying every morning, just as the muezzin started to chant from the village minaret. A slim blue tower, silhouetted against the peach-colored sky, was positively Baghdadian, and there was I standing on a chalky bridle path near a chalky stream bed, where separate serpent-like bands of water thinly glided over oval stones, where there was I holding a letter from Tamara. I looked at the abrupt Yela mountains, covered up to their rocky brows with the caracole of the dark tariq pine, at the maquis-like stretch of evergreen vegetation between the mountain and sea, and the translucent pink sky where a self-conscious crescent shone, with a single humid star near it, and the whole artificial scene struck me as something in a prettily illustrated, albeit sadly abridged edition of the Arabian Nights. Suddenly I felt the pangs of exile. There had been the case of Pushkin, of course, Pushkin who had wandered in banishment here among the naturalized cypresses and laurels, but though some prompting might have come from his elegies, I do not think my exaltation was a pose. Thenceforth, for several years, until the writing of a novel relieved me of that fertile emotion, the loss of my country was equated for me with the loss of my love. Meanwhile, the life of my family had completely changed, except for a few jewels astutely buried in the normal filling of a talcum powder container. We were absolutely ruined. But this was a very minor matter. The local Tartar government had been swept away by a brand new Soviet, and we were subjected to the preposterous and humiliating sense of utter insecurity. During the winter of 1917-1918, and well into the windy and bright Crimean spring, idiotic death toddled by our side every other day on the white Yalta pier, whereas you remember the lady of Chekhov's Lady with the Lapdog lost her lorgnette among the vacational crowd. Various harmless people had in advance weights attached to their feet, and then were shot through the both by tough Bolshevik sailors imported from Sevastopol for the purpose. My father was not harmless, had joined us by this time after some dangerous adventures, and in that region of lung specialists had adopted the mimetic disguises of a doctor without changing his name, simple and elegant as a chess annotator would have said of a corresponding move on the board. We dwelt in an inconspicuous villa that a kind friend, Countess Sophia Penin, had placed at our disposal. On certain nights, when rumors of nearing assassins were especially strong, the men of our family took turns patrolling the house. The slender shadows of oleander leaves would cautiously move in the sea breeze along a pale wall, as if pointing at something with a great show of stealth. We had a shotgun and a Belgian automatic, and did our best to pooh-pooh the decree which said that anyone unlawfully possessing firearms would be executed on the spot. Chance treated us kindly. Nothing happened beyond the shock we got in the middle of a January night, when a brigand-like figure, all swathed in leather and fur, crept into our midst, but it turned out to be only former chauffeur Tsiganov, who had thought nothing of riding all the way from St. Petersburg on buffers and in freight cars through the immense, frosty, and savage expanse of Russia, for the mere purpose of bringing us a very welcome sum of money unexpectedly sent us by some good friends of ours. He also brought the mail received at our St. Petersburg address, although it was that letter from Tamara. After a month's stay, Tsiganov declared the Crimean scenery bored him, and departed to go all the way back north, and a big bag over his shoulder containing various articles that we would have gladly given him had we thought he coveted them, such a trouser press, tennis shoes, nightshirts, an alarm clock, a flat iron, several other ridiculous things I have forgotten, and the absence of which only gradually came to light, if not pointed out with vindictive zeal by an anemic servant girl, whose pale charms he had also rifled. Curiously enough, he had prevailed upon us to transfer my mother's precious stones from the talcum powder container that he had once detected to a hole dug in the garden under a versatile oak, and there they all were after his departure. Then one spring day in 1918, when the pink puffs of blossoming almond trees enlivened the dark mountainside, the Bolsheviks vanished and singularly silent army of Germany replaced them. Patriotic Russians were torn between the animal relief of escaping native executioners and the necessity of owing their repetitive to a foreign invader, especially to the Germans. The latter, however, were losing their war in the West and came to Yalta on tiptoe. With difficult smiles, the army of grey apparitions easy for a patriot to ignore, and ignored it was, save for some rather ungrateful snickers at the half-hearted keep-off-the-grass signs that appeared on park lawns. A couple of months later, having nicely repaired the plumbing in various villas vacated by commissars, the Germans faded out in their turn. The whites trickled in from the east and soon began fighting the Red Army, which was attacking the Crimea from the north. My father became Minister of Justice in the regional department located in Simferopol, and his family was lodged near Yalta on the Livadian grounds, the Tsar's former domain, a brash, hectic gaiety associated with white-held towns. Brought back in a vulgarized version the amenities of peaceful years. Cafes did a wonderful business, all kinds of theaters thrived. One morning in a mountain trail, I suddenly met a strange cavalier, clad in Circassian costume, with a tense, perspiring face painted a fantastic yellow. He kept furiously tugging at his horse, which, without heeding him, proceeded down the steep path at a curiously purposeful walk, like that of an offended person leaving a party. I had seen runaway horses, but I had never seen a walk-away once before, and my astonishment was given still more pleasurable edge when I recognized the unfortunate rider as Mazshudhin, whom Tamara and I had so often admired on the screen. The film Haji Murad, after Tolstoy's tale of that gallant rough-riding mountain chief, was being rehearsed on the mountain passages of the range. Stop that brute. Держит prokleto животно, he said through his teeth as he saw me, but at that same moment, with a mighty sound of crunching and crushing stones, 2 authentic Tartars came running down to the rescue, and I trudged on with my butterfly net toward the upper crags where the exhumed race of Hippolyte Grayling was expecting me. In that summer of 1918, a poor little oasis of miraged youth, my brother and I used to frequent the amiable and eccentric family who owned the coastal estate Olitz. A bantering friendship soon developed between my coeval Lydia T. and me. Many younger people were always around, brown-limbed and braceleted young beauties, a well-known plater called Sorin, actors, a male ballet dancer, merry white army officers, some of whom were to die quite soon, and what with beach parties, blanket parties, bonfires, a moon-spangled sea, and a fair supply of Crimean Muscat Luno, a lot of amorous fun went on, and all the while against the frivolous, decadent, and somehow unreal background, which I was pleased to believe conjured up the atmosphere of Pushkin's visit to the Crimea a century later, Lydia and I played a little Ostal game of our own invention. The idea consisted of parodizing a biographic approach projected, as it were, into the future, and thus transforming the very specious present into a kind of paralyzed past as perceived by a doddering memoirist, who recalls through a helpless haze his acquaintance with a great writer when we were both young. For instance, either Lydia or I, it was a matter of chance inspiration, might say, on the terrace after supper, the writer liked to go out on the terrace after supper, where I shall always remember the remark V.V. made one warm night. "It is," he remarked, "a warm night." Or still sillier, he was in the habit of lighting a cigarette before smoking it, all this delivered with much pensive, reminiscent fervor, which seemed hilarious and harmless to us at the time, but now I catch myself wondering if we did not disturb unwittingly some perverse and spiritual demon, some spiteful demon. Through all those months, every time a bag of mail managed to get from the Ukraine to Yalta, there would be a letter for me and my Sinara. Nothing is more occult than the way of letters under the auspices of unimaginable carriers circulate through the weird mess of civil wars, but whenever, owing to that mess, there was some break in our correspondence, Tamara would act as if she ranked deliveries with ordinary natural phenomena, such as the weather or tides, which human affairs could not affect, and she would accuse me of not answering her, when in fact I did nothing but write to her and think of her during those months, despite my many betrayals. Happy is the novelist who manages to preserve an actual love letter that he received when he was young within a work of fiction, embedded in it like a clean bullet in flabby flesh and quite secure there among spurious lives. I wish I had kept the whole of our correspondence that way. Tomorrow's letters were a sustained conjuration of the rural landscape we know so well. There were, in a sense, a distant but wonderfully clear antiphonal response to the much less expressive lyrics I had once dedicated to her by means of unpampered words, whose secret I failed to discover. Her high school girlish prose could evoke with a plangent strength every whiff of damp leaf, every autumn rusted frond of fern in the St. Petersburg countryside. Why did we feel so cheerful when it rained? She asked in one of her last letters, reverting as it were to the pure source of rhetorics. Bоже moi, mon Dieu, rather than, my God, where has it gone? All that distant, bright, endearing Vosyo eto dalyoko svetlo milo. In Russian, no subject is needed here, since these are neuter adjectives that play the part of abstract nouns on a bare stage in a subdued light. Tomorrow, Russia, the wild wood grating into old gardens, my northern birches and firs, the sight of my mother getting down on her hands and knees to kiss the earth every time we came back to the country from town for the summer. Et la montagne et le grand chien. These are things that fate one day bundled up pell-mell and tossed out into the sea, completely severing me from my boyhood. I wonder, however, whether there really is much to be said for more anesthetic destinies. Let us say a smooth, safe, small-town continuity of time with its primitive absence of perspective, when at 50 one is still dwelling in a clapboard house of one's childhood, so that every time one cleans the attic one comes across the same pile of old brown schoolbooks, still together among later accumulations of dead objects, and where on summery Sunday mornings one's wife stops on the sidewalk to endure for a minute or two that terrible, garrulous, dyed, church-bound McGee woman, who way back in 1915 used to be pretty, naughty Margaret Ann of the mint-flavored mouth and nimble fingers. The break in my own destiny affords me in retrospect a syncopal kick that I would not have missed for words. Ever since that exchange of letters with Tamara, homesickness has been with me a sensuous and particular matter. Nowadays, the mental image of matted grass on the Yala, of a canyon in the Urals, or of salt flats in the Aral region, affects me nostalgically and patriotically as little or as much as, say, Utah, but give me anything or any continent resembling the St. Petersburg countryside, and my heart melts. What it would be actually to see again my former surroundings, I can hardly imagine. Sometimes I fancy myself revisiting them with a false passport under an assumed name. It could be done, but I do not think I shall ever do it. I have been dreaming of it too idly and too long. Similarly, during the latter half of my 16-month stay in the Crimea, I planned for so long a time to join Denikin's army, with the intention not so much of clattering astride a jam-friend charger into the cobbled outskirts of St. Petersburg, my poor Yuri's dream, as of reaching Tamara and her Ukrainian hamlet, that the army ceased to exist by the time I had made up my mind. In March of 1919, the Reds broke through in northern Crimea, and from various ports of tumultuous evacuation of anti-Bolshevik groups began, over a glassy sea in the Bay of Sebastopol, under wild machine gun fire from the shore. The Bolshevik troops had just taken the port. My family and I set out for Constantinople and Piraeus on a small and shoddy Greek ship, Nadezhda, Hope, carrying a cargo of dried fruit. I remember trying to concentrate as we were zigzagging out of the bay on a game of chess with my father. One of the knights had lost its head, and a poker chip replaced a missing rook, and the sense of leaving Russia was totally eclipsed by the agonizing thought that, the Reds or no Reds, letters from Tamara would still be coming, miraculously and needlessly, to southern Crimea, and would search there for their fugitive addressee, and weakly flap about like bewildered butterflies set loose in an alien zone at the wrong altitude among an unfamiliar flora.